and I'm the head of Department of International Relations and the International Laboratory on World Order Studies and the New Regionalism of High School of Economics, a university here in Moscow. And we're beginning our 10th session of Eurasian online seminar. We are delighted to have here one of the world leading intellectuals, Professor Kishore Mahbubani. And the topic of his talk is Has China Won?, which is the title of his new book devoted to relations between the United States and China. And because Professor Mahbubani is famous for, I would say, controversial book titles, which I think do not usually mean what the literal meaning is, because I think one of his most famous book was Can Asians Think? And we all know that it didn't really mean that Asians could not think. So I think, and one of his books was, I think, Has the US Lost?
Has the West lost it?
Has the West lost, yes. And Has China won? It doesn't really mean probably that China really won already. But we'll be delighted to listen to your opinion. So Professor Mahbubani currently is a distinguished fellow at the Asia Research Institute of National University of Singapore. He was with the Singapore Foreign Service for 33 years, where he served twice as Singapore's ambassador to the United Nations and held the position of President of the United Nations Security Council for about 1 year, from 2001 to 2002. He was permanent secretary of the Foreign Ministry of Singapore, which is, I think, the top civil servant position there. He was also the founding dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy for a long time, from 2004 to 2017. He is also a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He wrote several books, as I said. The most well-known of them is Can Asians Think?, as I said, Beyond the Age of Innocence, Rebuilding Trust Between America and the World, and the New Asian Hemisphere, the Irresistible Shift of Global Power to the East. His research interests are in the resurgence of Asia, ASEAN, public policies in Singapore, global geopolitics, and global governments. So his latest book on US-China relations, entitled, as I said, Has China Won? The Chinese Challenge to American Primacy. It was published this year. So we're excited to have you here and to discuss this topic which interests everyone. I would ask people who would like to ask questions to indicate it in the chat. And Professor Mahbubani would speak, as he said, for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have, he'll take questions, as many questions as he would like. So Professor Mahbubani, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alexander, for that very generous introduction. It's a great honor to succeed people like Ezra Vogel and Joseph Nye, who are also friends of mine in this dialogue here. And I noticed that Ezra began his talk by talking about his long association with Russia. And I was surprised that actually I had been to Moscow before Ezra had been. I first went to Moscow in 1974. And maybe before you were born, Alexander. I went there because I was on my way to study philosophy in Canada, and the cheapest way to go from Singapore to Canada was to take Aeroflot. So I took Aeroflot, arrived in Moscow, and spent a few days there. And then, of course, I came back to Moscow 2 years later with the then Foreign Minister of Singapore, Mr. S. Rajaratnam, a remarkable figure. And what I'll never forget is the meeting Mr. Rajaratnam and Mr. Gromyko, the legendary foreign minister of the Soviet Union at that time. And for me, of course, going to Moscow was very special because as a teenager, when I grew up and I was looking for exciting novels to read, I found, to my amazement and pleasant surprise, that the best novelists in the world were Russian novelists. So, of course, I read Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace and Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov. So, in a sense, I fell in love with Russia at a very young age. And so I'm very happy to continue this association over the years. And I would add also that the one Russian with whom I actually spent a lot of time recently was your current foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov. But you mentioned that Singapore was on the Security Council in 2001, 2002. Actually, I was president in January 2001 and May 2002. So in the Security Council, you're seated alphabetically. So Singapore and Russia sat side by side. So I sat next to Sergei Lavrov for 2 years in the council and got to know him. And I have enormous respect for him. If any of you or any of your listeners are in touch with Sergei Lavrov, tell him I'll be very happy to give him a copy of my new book, Has China Won? To him too. So what I plan to do, as you said, Alexander, is to speak about it for 13 minutes or so. And I want to, first of all, explain first why I wrote this book at this time. And of course, I wrote it for a very simple reason. I see a major global tragedy unfolding in the form of a major geopolitical contest between the United States and China. And you can you can see it coming for a long time. And I could see that mistakes were being made by the United States, mistakes were being made by China in the management of this dispute. So I said, why not I, as a neutral friend of America, friend of China, try to write a book that hopefully at the end of the day will bring the two sides together, hopefully. And that's the goal of this book, to avoid a major tragedy. Now, traditionally, after you write a book, you develop a very smooth talk about it, because you go on a book tour, you go to many different places, you talk to different audiences, you develop a stump talk. But, I haven't been able to leave the house since I wrote this book. So I really haven't developed a stump talk about the book. But I want to make, I guess, 5 points which I hope the book brings out. And the first major point I want to make, of course, which is in some ways an obvious one, which is that the United States has made a major geopolitical mistake in launching a major geopolitical contest against China without first working out a comprehensive long-term strategy on how to deal with a new challenger, China. And as I say in the book, the insight was actually given to me by one of America's greatest strategic thinkers, Henry Kissinger. I had the pleasure and the honor of having a one-on-one lunch with him in New York in March 2018. And in the course of the lunch, actually, that was the message I was getting from him. And so I wrote a paragraph saying, this is what I learned from Henry Kissinger, and he allowed me to put that paragraph in the book. But of course, in the book, I also begin by looking at what another great strategic thinker of America, George Kennan, and how he advised America. I think as many people in Russia, I think, know very well, George Kennan was the famous guy who wrote the X telegram, and of course, I published an article in Foreign Affairs on how the United States should deal with the then Soviet Union. Of course, he was the main, he's known as the advocate of the containment policy for the Soviet Union. But in addition to containment, he actually gave other very valuable pieces of advice to his fellow Americans as they embarked on the Cold War against the then Soviet Union. And there are 4 pieces of advice that he gave, which are very significant. The first one he said was the ultimate result of the contest with the Soviet Union will be determined by not what we do in the military sphere. Of course, you have the military dimension important. At the end of the day, what's important is your domestic spiritual vitality. Do you have a more vibrant or more dynamic society than the Soviet Union does? And he said that, at the end of the day, is the critical factor that will determine whether or not the United States will win. As you know, in the 50s and 60s, there was this ongoing debate, let's say between Khrushchev and Nixon, about which society was more dynamic, more vibrant. But he said that's the key area. And the second point that he made, George Kennan made when he advised his fellow Americans was, this is not a struggle we can win alone. We must cultivate friends and allies and develop as many friends and allies as we can if we're going to succeed in this great contest against the Soviet Union. And the third piece of advice, which is very interesting, he said, even though we will have many differences with the Soviet Union, even though we will have many differences with Moscow, we must never insult the Soviet Union. Because we will have, at some points, we have to deal with the Soviet Union, we have to deal with common challenges. So we must not engage in insults. That's not what a great power should do. And the fourth piece of advice, which is a very important piece of advice, he said, whatever we do, we must be humble. We mustn't be arrogant vis-a-vis the rest of the world. So what's interesting is that when the United States was launching this major contest, engaged in a major contest with the Soviet Union, he thought very hard, very deeply about what it should do, what it shouldn't do, and is captured in George Kennan's 4 pieces of advice. But what's interesting is that when it comes to this new geopolitical contest against China, which I think will prove to be a much more formidable competitor for the United States than the Soviet Union was, and like the reason for many reasons that I give the book. But for a start, China's population is 4 times the size of United States, and as you know, the Soviet Union's population never came to be as big as United States. And China has a history that's 4,000 years old. So it's a very strong, resilient civilization. Indeed, as Professor Wang Gangwu told me, is the only major civilization that's been knocked down 4 times and stood up 4 times. So it's a very strong, resilient civilization. So in taking on a much stronger force, the United States has ventured into it very thoughtlessly and without working out any kind of comprehensive long-term strategy, and in fact, ignoring wise pieces of advice that George Kennan gave. So that's one of the key themes of my book. Of course, another key point I make in the book, is my second point, is that in any geopolitical contest, it's never the case that one side is making mistakes and the other side is not. Life is not like that. We are all human. We all make mistakes. And as I explained in one of the chapters, China has made mistakes too. And I devote a whole chapter to China's biggest strategic mistake. And in my view, as I explained in the book, China's biggest strategic mistake was to alienate the American business community. And I say that because, from time to time, from the 1990s, 2000s, there were occasions when various American governments would want to take a strong stand against China. For example, as you know, Bill Clinton ran his campaign in 1992. He said, when he was running against the then President George H.W. Bush, Father Bush, Bill Clinton said, unlike President George Bush, I will not coddle the butchers of Beijing. So he said, I will take a tough line on China. And of course, strangely enough, that was November 1992. 1 year later, I happened to be in Seattle for attending the first APEC Leaders Summit meeting. And I was present in the room when Bill Clinton and Jiang Zemin of China met each other. And initially there was a lot of tension, but I could see Bill Clinton coddling Jiang Zemin. So, you could see that leaders make promises and then they change their minds. And this is what happens to American presidents. And, but of course, behind one of the key reasons why Bill Clinton was, in a sense, being nice to China is that the American business community was pushing him also to say, hey, China is a big market for us. And certainly for Boeing, China has proven to be one of the biggest markets. For General Motors has made, I think, more money now in China than it does in the United States. So the business community was always there, putting the brakes on any efforts by the American government to attack China, because the American businessmen didn't want to lose money from the Chinese market. But what's interesting is that when President Trump launched his trade war against China in 2017, 2018, then the natural thing to have happened would have been for the American business community to have come in and to the picture and say, stop, President Trump, you're spoiling our biggest market. But this time, they kept absolutely quiet. They didn't say a word. And that was a very powerful signal of how much China had alienated the American business community. And I also explained how that process of alienation happened. May not necessarily have been central government policy, but you can have very arrogant provincial officials who insist that American companies share their technology, who engage in bullying of American companies and treating them harshly, saying, we're doing you a favor by giving you the Chinese market, and so on and so forth. So in all kinds of reasons, the American business community in China became alienated. But also, there's also one other point I make in the book, of which, frankly, I'm not 100% certain, but I think a lot of the alienation of the American business community happened also after the 2008-2009 financial crisis. And why is that financial crisis important? Because I think during that financial crisis, clearly it looked as though after the collapse of the Lehman Brothers, United States looked as though it was on the ropes. And of course, one of the interesting stories is that the United States Treasury actually sent a delegation to Beijing in 2008, 2009, saying, hey, we are now in the middle of a major financial crisis. Please don't stop buying US Treasury bills, because if you stop buying US Treasury bills, China markets will get worse. America will suffer, and so on and so forth. I tell that story because I suspect that must have made some of the Chinese in Beijing feel very strong, saying, aha, the Americans are now coming to us for help. And of course, later on, the Chinese discovered that they didn't really have much of a hold on the US Treasury bills because the United States launched the QE process. And the QE process completely, of course, reduced American reliance on Chinese buying US Treasury bills. And so the Chinese lost, in a sense, a hold that they had over the United States. But anyway, the reason why I tell that story, it's a complicated story, is that I think that after 2008, 2009, the Chinese, who had actually been advised, as you know, by very famously by Deng Xiaoping, saying, take a low profile, swallow insults, let's not strive for leadership. Somehow or other, a certain degree of arrogance crept into the Chinese behavior to the rest of the world, a certain degree of assertiveness, and then suddenly you got issues in the South China Sea and all emerging. But one of the things I say in the book, and this is what I'd be interested to know whether people in Moscow and elsewhere would agree with me, paradoxically, China's assertiveness was not a result of strong leadership, but possibly because of weaker leadership. Because around that period, as we know, China also saw an explosion of major domestic problems in the form of corruption that was rising, in the form of factionalism that was rising internally. So the internal relative weaknesses may have explained some of the assertiveness externally. But that's a thesis I have, but I want to see whether others agree with that. So that's another theme in my book. And of course, but the third and probably most important point I want to make is that I actually discuss in the book specifically some of the major misunderstandings that Americans have in their understanding of China. And here, you know, building on a very famous piece of advice that was given by Sun Tzu, Chinese strategist, he said, "Know thyself, know thine enemies, fight 1,000 battles, win 1,000 battles." And what I try to explain in the book is that the United States has not fulfilled the first leg of that advice, know thyself, and has not fulfilled the other leg, know thine enemies. So what I show in the book is that while Americans are aware of their strengths, and by the way, I begin the book by talking about the formidable strengths of the United States. Okay, the United States is the one country that has won every struggle it got involved in the 20th century, by the way, the First World War, the Second World War, the struggle against Japan, the Cold War. So one must never underestimate the United States. But the United States is a country, while it's aware of its strengths, is not aware of its weaknesses. And vis-a-vis China, while the United States is aware of China's weaknesses, China is not aware, United States is not aware of China's strengths. So the way I provide a balancing here is that I want Americans to be aware of their weaknesses and to be aware of China's strengths. And I'll give a concrete example of that. The Americans, especially after winning the Cold War against the Soviet Union, they have come to the strong ideological belief that whenever you have a contest between a vibrant, dynamic democracy and a communist party system, a vibrant, dynamic democracy will always win. Because democracies are by definition strong, vibrant societies. They have enjoyed the support of people. And in communist societies, you have dictatorial rule and they're suppressing the people and they cannot succeed. So I said, now, is that description true in the US-China relationship? So I dig deep into American democracy. And I say, yes, there was a time when American democracy was strong and vibrant, fulfilling the dictate of what George Kennan advised, which is that it was, it had a lot of spiritual vitality. But one amazing statistic which I provide in the book, which actually I was shocked to discover myself, is that the United States is the only major developed economy where the average income of the bottom 50, I repeat, 50% has gone down over a 30-year period. And as I quote two Princeton University economists in the book, Case and Deaton, they point out that this slide, in the downward slide in the average income of the bottom 50% has created a sea of despair among the white working classes, and it creates all kinds of pathologies in American society, like opioid addiction, high infant mortality rates, lower life expectancy. So all kinds of problems are developing in American society. So there may have been a time when American democracy was doing well, but actually in the last 30 years it's not been doing well. And the other structural point I make, I don't have much time to cover it, but I want to drop the idea for discussion in Q&A, is that the fundamental problem in America is that in the past, it was the people who control the political system, and the capitalists, I guess, control the economic system. But what's happened, and this I try to document in the book, is that the rich in America have actually hijacked the political system. And there's been a massive transfer of wealth to the top 1%, 0.1% of America. So America, which used to be a democracy, has functionally become a plutocracy, where it is serving the interests of the very rich. And I'm not the only one to make this observation, by the way. Probably the most famous and influential economics columnist in the world is Martin Wolf, and Martin Wolf has also said that America today is a functioning plutocracy and not a democracy. So that's a structural weakness that has developed in America. And by contrast, when you look at China, which is supposed to be a rigid, dysfunctional Communist Party system, what's amazing is that the spiritual vitality that the United States lacks today is something that China has today, the spiritual vitality. And I quote a Stanford University psychologist, Jean Fan, who says that when you go to China, you meet people who feel very optimistic about the future, and unlike America, they don't feel depressed about the condition. And how has this happened? And of course, the most critical fact to know in this area is that the bottom 50% in America, which has experienced a slide downwards, in China you have the exact opposite, where the bottom 50% in China have seen the greatest improvement in their living standards that they have seen over the past 40 years. The improvement that they have experienced is the best that they have experienced in 4,000 years. So this is amazing transformation of Chinese society. And as I say in the book, I first went to China much later than I went to Moscow. I went to Beijing in 1980. And when I first went to Beijing in 1980, Mao's Deng Xiaoping had taken over, but it was still very much a Maoist society. People couldn't choose what to wear. They wore Maoist suit. They couldn't choose where to live. They couldn't choose where to work. They couldn't choose what to study. And certainly there were no Chinese tourists going overseas, zero. Today you go to China, the Chinese people can choose what to wear, where to live, where to work, what to study. Each year, 300,000 Chinese go to study in American universities. And amazingly, 134 million Chinese leave China freely, and 134 million Chinese return to China freely. So they obviously like their society a lot, and they're going back to it. And so I also try to understand why this has happened. Why has China become such a high-performing society, delivering such high economic growth, and also delivering social development? It's not just economic development, but social development is also critical in China. In terms of healthcare, education, and everything, China is doing very well. So what has China done right? And here I say that what China has done right is that in the Communist Party of China has effectively become a meritocracy. And what do I mean by meritocracy? A meritocracy is a system that selects the best people to run the organization. And this is not something unusual. I mean, if you go to the big consultancy firms, McKinsey, Bain, they only select you if you are the best person to join the company. Certainly, you cannot become a professor in Harvard unless you're one of the best in the world. So just as the great successful organizations succeed by becoming meritocracies, the Chinese Communist Party today is a remarkable meritocracy. And I tell the story in my book, just one story to illustrate this. When I was doing my research for the book, I spent some time in Columbia University also, in addition to Harvard University. And when I was in Columbia University assigned a young graduate student to be my research assistant at Columbia University. And she was a young lady from China, and she was doing a master's in Columbia. So I was talking to her one day, and I said, "Tell me about your life and everything." She said one thing she was very excited about was that when she graduated from high school, she was number 2 in the high school. So I said, "Oh, number 2 is very good. What's wrong with being number 2? She said, "I was so sad that I was number 2 because when you graduate from a high school, only the number 1 gets to join the Chinese Communist Party." She dreamt of joining the Chinese Communist Party, and she couldn't get in because she was number 2. Now, can you imagine that, right? So how the quality of mind of people in China is remarkable. And of course, and this is a point I suppose we can discuss in COVID-19, my point about the US becoming a plutocracy, in some ways a dysfunctional society, and China becoming a meritocracy is also shown by the way, in the way in which they have managed COVID-19. It's actually quite stunning how incompetently the United States has managed it. And in the case of China, after the mistakes that they initially made in Wuhan, once they woke up, they really did a fantastic job of taking care of COVID-19. And that illustrates various things about the society, about the quality of decision-making, the structures of the societies, and so on and so forth. So this is an example of how the United States doesn't understand its own weaknesses, and it doesn't understand China's strengths. And of course, the question I raised in the book, I have a chapter in the book called "Can America Make U-Turns?" And of course, the Americans pride themselves on being a democracy, and so they say in a democracy, you're open and flexible, and you can adapt yourself. So I say, okay, let me see whether that's true. And so, take for example, going back to the very first point that George Kennan made. He says that at the end of the day, the struggle will be determined not on the basis of your military strength, or on the quality of your society. So I said, okay, if that's the case, can America make a U-turn, cut down its defense budget, and invest the money in its own people? Can it stop fighting unnecessary wars overseas? So, for example, when I said earlier that the standard of living of the bottom 50% in America had gone down over a 30-year period, if America had not fought the war in Iraq, it would have saved $5 trillion. And if he had given the $5 trillion to the bottom 50% in America, they would have got a check, each one of them, of $30,000 each. And that's a very important figure, because one thing that is shocking about American society is that it's such an affluent society, but 2/3 of Americans' households don't have $500 in emergency cash when the country is burning away trillions of dollars fighting in the Middle East. And at the same time, the defense budget is huge and unnecessary. And the question is, can America cut down its defense budget? So I explained in the book, actually, even though America has had brilliant defense secretaries like Ash Carter, a Harvard professor like James Mattis, the defense secretaries cannot cut the defense budget. They want to cut it, they cannot cut it. Because the defense budget is determined by the congressman who want some projects in their districts. So they will say, no, you can cut the defense budget, but don't cut my project. So the defense budget keeps growing. You don't need to grow it. That's not what you need in this contest against China. So that's an example of how this dynamic democracy, as I explained, has actually become very rigid in its decision-making processes, and as a result, incapable, therefore, of meeting the Chinese challenges. And I can give some other examples later on about the US dollar and other matters when we do the Q&A. But I want to go to my fourth and fifth points. The fourth point I want to make is that one of the critical points I make is that at the end of the day, the outcome of this US-China geopolitical contest will to some extent be determined by what is done in America, what's done in China, but it will also be determined at the end of the day. I say there may be 330 million people in America and there are 1.4 billion people in China. There's still 6 billion people who live outside the US and China. And what are the views of these 6 billion people? And I say that unlike the first Cold War, when many of America's allies in Europe, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, all enthusiastically joined the United States in this geopolitical contest. Today, you notice in the geopolitical contest against China, most countries are stepping back and saying, no, 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 no. If you want to go ahead and you want to go ahead in this contest, leave us out. We want to focus on our development. We don't want to get involved. We don't want to sign up for this contest. And I go on to discuss how Europe's interests in the first Cold War are very different than in the contest against China. And then similarly, even if you look at countries like India and Japan, and even Australia, as you know, the United States is trying very hard to develop a new kind of containment policy against China, but it'd be very difficult for countries like India, Japan, or Australia and others, because they actually do far more trade with China than they do with the United States. So they have to pay a much bigger economic price if they join any kind of Cold War campaign against China. And of course, the Chinese have also been very astute geopolitically in creating a lot of dependence on the part of the neighbors on the Chinese economy. And this dependence, of course, has been growing over time. And that's a result of shrewd long-term policies on their part. I'll give you one example. In ASEAN, ASEAN was founded in the Cold War as a pro-American organization. But today, if you look at ASEAN and the 10 ASEAN countries, most of them actually do more trade with China than they do with the United States. There are, of course, huge reservoirs of goodwill in Southeast Asia towards the United States that they can actually exploit. But, you know, the United States is being, as you know, treating its friends and allies, especially under the Trump administration, with some disdain. And the Trump administration has failed to turn up for ASEAN meetings, sending very low-level officials. So in that sense, that again, this is an illustration of how the Americans are not being very geopolitically shrewd, while the Chinese are being geopolitically shrewd. So I do believe that the reaction of the 6 billion people will be critical. And I think the 6 billion people, I think not many of them will rush to join either side, by the way. Either rush to join the United States or rush to join China against the United States. They will say, hey, we don't want to get involved in this contest. Now, the final point I want to make, which is the final chapter of my book, where I try, as I said at the beginning, my goal is to try and avoid this geopolitical contest. I try to advise both America and China that they will be better off if they didn't get locked into this major geopolitical contest. And I talk about 5 non-contradictions between the US and China. But I'll just mention 2 of them. The first one is that I say that if the primary goal of the US government is to improve the well-being of its own people, 330 million American people, and frankly, as I document in the book, if there's one national priority the United States should have, it should not be to try and fix the rest of the world. It should be to fix the condition of American society. because American society is now facing fundamental domestic challenges. And similarly, if the primary goal of China is to take care of its 1.4 billion people and to improve the conditions, and one must remember that even though China has been spectacularly successful for the last 40 years, it is still, the reality is that China's per capita GNP is less than $10,000. United States is above $60,000. So there's still a big gap, and China should focus on its internal development. And to be fair, that's what the goal of the Chinese government is. So if the primary goal of the US government is to take care of its own people, and the primary goal of the Chinese government is to take care of its own people, there's no contradiction down there. They can work together and develop it. Of course, one of the key questions I posed in the book is that what should be the primary goal of the American government? Should it be to improve the well-being of its 330 million American people, or to preserve the primacy of America in the international sphere? And unfortunately, a lot of people in Washington, D.C. have become addicted to primacy. And they believe that primacy should be the primary goal, when in fact, the addiction to primacy, the result of that has been the fact that the American people have suffered as a result. So that's why it may be wise for the Americans to reshift their priorities and focus on the well-being of the American people and not worry too much about the primacy dimension. So that's the first non-contradiction between US and China. And the second non-contradiction, I say that if you look at what are the primary challenges the world faces today, many of the challenges the world faces are common challenges, like global warming, for example, is really the #1 challenge that all of humanity faces. We should be coming together to deal with it, because no one country can solve global warming on its own. Similarly, certainly, if there's one lesson we learned from COVID-19, is that we are all on the same boat, that the virus doesn't respect any borders, and we've seen the greatest shutdown of the global economy because of a virus. And this virus should actually, in theory, bring together the countries. In fact, one of the oldest rules in geopolitics is that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Now, for the United States, the enemy #1 is COVID-19, the virus. Now, if the virus is the #1 enemy, and China is also an enemy of the virus, the United States and China should come together to fight COVID-19. That would be the sensible thing to do. But unfortunately, you've seen already in the past few weeks, the opposite has happened. And with the opposite happening, unfortunately, it's proven the thesis of my book that a major geopolitical contest is developing between US and China. COVID-19 should have stopped it, but it has actually sadly accelerated it, and confirming the thesis of my book. But I make the point that if the United States and China, and I'm going to conclude with this thought, continue to be engaged in this geopolitical contest while the common global challenges are becoming more and more important, future generations will look at them as being close to two tribes of apes that continued fighting each other while the forest around them was burning, right? And certainly that's not a very intelligent thing to do. So at the end of the day, I hope that my book will be helpful in persuading the leaders of the United States and China that please think again before you march into this geopolitical contest. Think about the common interests of humanity. Think about your own people, and we might have better outcomes. So let me stop there, and let me throw the floor open to questions from all of you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for your insightful thoughts. We have a lot of questions already, but Professor Karaganov, do you want to give?
Oh, yes, of course. First of all, thank you for your brilliant and elegant soliloquy. I mean, it is an example of, let's say, brilliant unorthodoxy, but it was very good. And basically, of course, I agree with your with your analysis. There is one addition with China. Soviet Union lost because it didn't have the viable system within, and people were tired. But the second reason was that it fought on two fronts, the West and China. And the Chinese were clever enough long ago to build up a relationship with Russia, with its strategic power, which is extremely friendly. And the United States has not been able to tear us apart. And that's why China could also in this long-term competition rely on strategic strength of Russia. So I think that the United States will lose. But the question is different, from a different view. Do you think Chinese could do anything to better the relationship? It was not their choice. They made their mistakes, and one of them you mentioned. But do they have any choice but to confront the United States now, when they are, ruthlessly contained and I would say, and of course, people in the United States do not hesitate to name names, to use all kinds of words, engage China. So they could they possibly, the Chinese yield, or what could they possibly do if to better the relationship with the United States, if any?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. By the way, I completely agree with you that the Soviet Union lost partly because of internal reasons and partly because Nixon and Kissinger very cleverly got China on their side. But on China, I do emphasize, I keep saying that, I remember when I talk about the United States made a geopolitical mistake in launching a contest against China without looking at strategy. I do emphasize that it is the United States that has decided to launch this contest and not China. China, in fact, has tried very hard to avoid this contest. And indeed, I think in some ways, my book is helpful to China because the Americans believe, and of course they do it in a very strange logic. The Americans believe is that when I'm number one, I try to control everything in the world. So when China becomes number one, China wants to control everything in the world. I said, no. The Chinese goals are very limited. The Chinese goals essentially are to, they have a very simple, very fundamental goal. They suffered 100 years of humiliation from 1842 to 1949. And I talk about that century of humiliation, which of course the West delivered to China. And I say what the Chinese want to make sure is that they're no longer humiliated. And the Chinese, unlike the Americans, do not think that they are better off running the world. They are quite happy running China. They would like to have a stable world order, which they will participate in, but they have no desire to replace the United States in trying to be the number one in the world. And at the same time, the Americans have a kind of universalizing mission. The Americans believe that the whole world will be better off if the whole world copies America and becomes mini Americas. The Chinese view is very different. Chinese view, no. We are Chinese. You're not Chinese. Our civilization is good for us. You have your own culture. You have your own civilization. You carry on. We're not going to change you. So the Chinese have no desire to step into the American shoes to say, take over or transform other societies and so on and so forth. So, and that's why, frankly, that's actually one of my other non-contradiction in the final chapter, that actually that's why United States and China, if they want to, they can live in peace with each other. And if the United States wants to send its Navy around the world, carry on, send your Navy around the world. In fact, paradoxically, incidentally, the US Navy is keeping sea lanes free so that products can go from Latin America to China. So the US Navy is actually serving Chinese national interests, as I say in the book. So I think if the Chinese could find a very intelligent interlocutor on the American side, I think they could explain to the Americans that there's no reason for us to have this contest. But of course, you know, the American body politic, and this is another point in my book, Washington, D.C. used to be a kind of a thoughtful capital. You know? You would meet people who look at the big picture and try and figure out, you know, how the world is going. But I find that the Washington, D.C., which spends more money on strategic think tanks than any other city in the world, has got some of the worst strategic thinking in the world. And it's a great paradox. And especially now in America, it's so sad that even people who understand that this anti-China hysteria that is developed in America is crazy. It's crazy. It's not the right thing. But you cannot speak out against it. You cannot speak out against it. You'll be crucified if you do that. And that's why I hope that as someone like me, standing outside, I hope that my book serves as a small fire extinguisher saying, hey, think again. What are you doing? So in that sense, and I must say that the American friends of mine who have read the book carefully understand the message and have actually thanked me for writing the book at this time.
We shall order your book and offer it to some of the better publishing houses. Maybe it will be published in Russia. From what
I would love to see it published in Russia.
Yeah. I think we have a good chance. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Now we have Professor Sergei Trush, who is an expert on US-China relations. Where are you, Dr. Trush?
I'm here. Thank you.
Yeah.
Do you hear me?
Yes, I do.
Thank you, Professor, for your perspective on the China-US situation, which I think one of the most systemic look at the problem. Usually people look at US-China relations more on the surface geopolitical level. You try to see the inner contradictions between two great societies. So I would be delighted to have your book in full and to discuss it probably later. My question also, I would, do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. I would like to comment shortly on one of the passages of your current talk when you were talking about the success story of China as a society, as a modernizing society. I would agree that the social outcomes of this 40 decades of modernization period was quite positive at this very level, but at the same time I would like to point out that China is now on the verge of serious stage evolution to a new phase of its development, with many motives for that. But speaking of the general economic, socio-economic, I would say that. Excuse me? China is facing the new phase of development. China needs the more motives for internal consumption. China needs the more vibrant and socially guaranteed middle class. Middle class will need certain types of social, economic, and political guarantees in the new phase of its development. My sense is that Chinese political system at this very moment is not very ready for that. And my main question is, what is your perspective, given the new evolution phase of China economy from extensive economy to more intensive, from ecologically disastrous to ecologically knowledgeable, from oriented on the society, social oriented. What would be your perspective how China will change its societal and political image and system? To what extent it will be going on the Korean, Taiwanese way, or what will be the peculiarities of China political development under these socio-economic challenges it is facing?
Yeah, those are two very, very good questions. And you know, by the way, one lesson I learned in life after studying societies, I guess for 50 years now, is that there's no such thing as a perfect society. Every society has got challenges, but I've discovered that societal challenges are unique to their own societies. You know, so I mean, I'll give you an example, right? Like Japan, for example. As you know, the conventional wisdom for the last 30 years is that the Japanese society has been stagnating, you know, not growing or whatever it is. But actually, the Japanese enjoy a very good quality of life. And I just finished writing an article saying the Japanese quality of life, their per capita income is half of America, but the quality of life is double of America. So that's an example of different societies. Now, in the case of China, you're absolutely right that I think the key area where China is a challenge is in their political system. Because when you develop the world's largest middle class, and I think by now, I think China already has the world's largest middle class, the expectations are different and they have to be managed very, very differently. And I also believe, and this is the message, I guess an ideological assumption of mine, that in the long run, all societies will become democracies, and China will become a democracy too, but nowhere in the near future at all. Because China has observed how if you make a quick transition to democracy, you always have problems. So in terms of what the model will be for China, I don't think that they will copy either South Korea or Taiwan or anybody else. I think they have to work it out internally themselves. And if you look at Chinese political culture, China's political history, the big lesson that the Chinese have learned over 4,000 years is that when the center is weak, the people suffer. But when the center is strong, the people benefit. So there's a very strong political, so that's why you notice, for example, I mean, the data incidentally shows that I just participated in the launch of something called the Edelman Trust Barometer. And the country where the people had the highest level of trust in the government is China, is 90%. So even though China doesn't have a democracy, China actually enjoys a very high degree of support by its people. And there's a very interesting article a friend of mine has just written. It's been published in Foreign Policy. His name is Eric Lee, L-I. He's actually an entrepreneur who lives in Shanghai, Eric Lee. And he says China has a good emperor today, Xi Jinping. Read that article. And it confirms my experience when I spent 2 months in Shanghai. You know, when I talked about the psychologist saying that Chinese society today enjoys a vibrancy and so on and so forth. You know, what's interesting is that if China was a rigid communist society, it would have no entrepreneurs. if you want to meet the most dynamic entrepreneurs in the world, you go to China. It's amazing, the startups in China. And I visited some of them personally in Shanghai, by the way. So I think the Chinese political system will adapt and evolve, but that's not a problem of today. I would say there's a problem of 30 to 40 years down the road, because they still have a lot of growth going for them. Now, your second question was on the ecological dimension. And here I would say, frankly, China is leading the world, because China is the first country to come up with the idea of an ecological civilization. And as you know, the Chinese in their first phase of industrialization made mistakes like everybody else, industry first, coal plants first, destroy the forests. But today, unless I'm mistaken, please double check. Don't hold me to this, please double check this. I think the largest forestation programs in the world are being carried out in China. That's an example of an ecological civilization. So the Chinese have are very adaptable. They understand when the circumstances in the world change, you got to change too. So for example, when the United States, the Trump administration, walked away from the Paris Climate Accords, China and India both should have walked away from it too. Say, okay, if the richest country in the world doesn't want to support climate change, why should I support climate change remediation? And China and India stayed and said, no, we will carry on our obligations under the Paris Accord. So all these are examples of how, if you look at China objectively, China is behaving very responsibly in many areas, and certainly in the ecological area, environmental area, behaving much more responsibly than the United States is.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Frankly, I think if you go to North Korea and ask them about trust of the government, the level would be even 150%, even more than it.
I don't think Edelman will be allowed in the North Korea.
All right. Well, now we have a question from Nikolai Petrov, who is a professor at the University of Rhode Island.
Hello, Professor. I think you've answered one of my questions already in your remarks. So I'd like to skip to the second part of my question, which is there a conceptual alternative to what drives American strategic thinking, which I think is a rather primitive form of realism? Is there a conceptual Chinese alternative, a brand that China could offer as its model of thinking as an alternative to the realism, which is part of a core component of IR theory, which is taught basically throughout the world as science? And it seems to me that China would do well to begin to develop, if it hasn't already, I may simply be ignorant, an alternative conception of the way a new world order could be constructed, that is benevolent or benign, I should say, but not driven innately by the conflicts that realism presumes. Thank you.
Well, I mean, I was telling Alexander Lukin, I just did a dialogue with John Mearsheimer last week in Australia. I think you can catch it on the video. And actually, in preparation for the dialogue with John Mearsheimer, who I think you consider America's number one realist, and I quote him a lot in this book, That's China One, by the way. And what I quote him in the book is, as you know, I've also reread some chapters in his book, The Great Delusion. And the thesis of The Great Delusion is that what's gone wrong with American foreign policy, especially since the end of the Cold War, is that the liberals have hijacked American foreign policy, and the liberals believe that the goal of America is to clean up the world, and they have been spending American treasure, American resources, trying to fix problems that cannot be fixed, like in the Middle East. And his description, I mean, I have amazing quotes from Great Delusion inside here. His description of the scale of American mistakes as a result, the liberal delusion are amazing. So if America went back to being realist, America would be a much better place. It would decide, for example, that it cannot fix the Middle East. It should just leave the Middle East. It should stop dropping bombs on Islamic countries. It doesn't make sense. It would achieve nothing by doing that. So on the side of the United States, I know that realism is taught in American universities, but it is not practiced in American strategic thinking. In fact, as I document in the book, that's one of the biggest flaws. And that's why I actually quote Kennan, because Kennan was a realist. And he said, this is how you handle the world. And American policies have been built on delusions rather than on realism. And in the case of China, I don't think you can find a simple doctrine that explains how the Chinese think. But I suspect if there's one key word that explains China's behavior, it is pragmatism. And of course, China was very lucky. The reason why China did so well for 40 years is that after Mao, they had Deng Xiaoping. And Deng Xiaoping was the ultimate pragmatism. And in fact, the best definition of pragmatism was given by Deng Xiaoping when he said, it doesn't matter whether a cat is black or a cat is white. If it catches mice, it is a good cat, right? So it doesn't matter whether it's communism or capitalism. If you can grow your economy, I will take it. Whatever works, I will use it. And I think that spirit of pragmatism is very much a part of Chinese policy. So they don't necessarily, see in the case of the United States, the view of the world is always black and white. You're either for me or you're against me. You know, there's nothing in between very often. The Chinese are quite happy to say, okay, you and I can agree 60% of the time, we disagree 40% of the time. Doesn't matter, we can still work with each other, right? And that's the spirit of pragmatism that they make. And they are also able to shift course, right? So, for example, for a while, they were very, very assertive on the South China Sea. You know? Now they decided that maybe they should be a bit more careful. So they're still holding on to their position, but they're trying to work out solutions down there. So that's what I would describe. That's how I would describe Chinese policies domestically and globally.
Thank you.
Thanks. Now we have Anastasia Petachkova, who is a researcher at our faculty. She wants to make a short comment.
Yeah, thank you very much. I was asked to make a comment, and actually you told in the beginning of your speech that you fell in love with Russia after reading Russian literature, and the same I can say after reading Lee Kuan Yew's book. I fell in love with Singapore. Okay, so I would like to tackle some issues that you actually raised in not only in this book, but also in some previous works, such as Great Convergence, for instance, because you wrote there about pandemia and about many problems that actually we see in a full scale now. And I guess the analogy we can have for the modern world is that 4 horsemen of apocalypse have already come, right? So we have disease already, the famine is coming, the deaths can be caused by economic problems in and war. Well, we already have traditional conflicts and the conflict between the US and China, and we don't know where it leads to. So I love your thought about the fact that the West is rather rigid and the East, so to say, is more adaptable and be able to adapt. And I guess it is also comes from the fact that many Eastern countries have come through transition and through change of approaches recently. And they have this habit of accepting the mistakes and picking another way. And I also loved the thought that we had in Great Convergence book about expanding China and narrowing world. So basically, it was about China threat, if I understood it correctly, that the place of cooperation is narrowing and we are becoming closer each other, and the extent in China is perceived as a threat in this sense. And you told that the world doesn't notice basically Chinese strengths, and I guess it's the matter of habit as well. And the way we used to think about some regimes or some countries or some approaches, because, well, it is hard to understand that some other country rather than the Western country can be efficient in solving problems, but I guess it's not really true. And it's also a matter of what is called soft power, maybe, because the image and China was, and you told that the US doesn't actually intervene in coronavirus and they accept it themselves, and China did. China helped other countries, but it was treated as mask diplomacy and not as help. So China actually did some correct things, but they were treated not an appraisal way, right? Not as China did something good, but rather than China did something bad. And I guess this approach also matters, and also adds the point into this developing confrontation. So how we deal with this or that purposes. As for, and this also raised the question of global leadership and global institutions. I guess many people say that there are no many strong leaders right now, but maybe that's again due to the fact that the education and the system we have now gave more opportunities to other people than it was recently. And it is like with the US, right? It's not that the US became weaker, but others became stronger. So maybe with the leaders in different spheres, it's more or less the same. And in your previous speeches and books, you wrote that if institutions are weak, it is to someone's benefit. So maybe my question would be, is it still beneficial to have weak international institutions? And we see that many countries are dealing on their own with coronavirus, but still we are on the same boat. And I guess the issue of injustice and global ethics is rising in a new angle. For instance, what China is actually doing is kind of filling in the gaps of what was considered injustice in the liberal international order. For instance, many Western countries insist on regime change, and that was maybe considered unjust or that we can avoid it, and China accepts everyone with any regime. The same comes with win-win cooperation. For instance, we know that in liberal international orders, some countries have won from it, others did not, and China tries to build up a new equality, so to say, in this sense. The same goes with ecological problems or the ecological civilization that you also mentioned. So that is another gap that was not filled in during the previous period. So maybe China can also, or is trying to rebalance that into a new approach. And they have the concept of, in theoretical perspective, is the concept of moral realism that Yan Xiaotong promotes. So what do you think about Chinese moral leadership, and maybe not even only Chinese, but another non-Western approaches that we have now? Are they more moral, so to say, in the modern world, and what kind of ideas may be beneficial today, and what could be the ratio between national and international approaches, as we now see that international institutions are not really efficient to the modern challenges that we have. Yeah, I guess I can stop here, and thank you very much for your lecture.
Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you very much for reading so much of my writings.
I'm prepared.
and citing them. But let me just make two very quick points, because I realize I have to stop in about 10 minutes or less. I have another appointment. The first point I'll make, since you refer to the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, is that I want to emphasize that I've always been an optimist in my writings. I believe that the world has become a much better place in 2020 than it was certainly when I was born in 1948, much better than when I grew up as a child. And I have experienced an explosive improvement in my own standard of living because I grew up in a typical third world country with a per capita income that was the same as Ghana's in 1950s, 1960s, and now it's a per capita income as high as the United States in some ways. So, I've lived through a fantastic transformation in my life, and I see it happening all throughout Asia. So I'm an optimist about the future. And on the Great Convergence, as you know, I conclude the book, The Great Convergence, with a very important message, especially to the United States, which is now, as you know, attacking international institutions. I say in that book, The Great Convergence, that Bill Clinton gave a very famous speech in Yale in 2003, where he said, if America is going to be number one forever, then America can keep on doing whatever it's doing. But Bill Clinton added the part, he said, but if we can conceive of a world where we're no longer number one, then it's in America's national interest to strengthen multilateral institutions, multilateral processes, multilateral norms, multilateral rules. Now, America hasn't done that yet. But at some point, I think Americans will realize it's in their interest to do so. And fortunately, China, under President Xi Jinping, is ready to, as you know, if you read his speeches that he gave in Davos and in Geneva, I was in Davos and I heard him. He's committed to strengthening the multilateral order. So if we can persuade the United States, using Bill Clinton's arguments that it is in America's interest to strengthen multilateral institutions, then I think we can possibly actually get a better world in the years to come. But I hope Americans will read as much of my books as you are doing. Thank you.
Well, thanks. Because you have to go soon, maybe you can take the last question from India, from General Banerjee.
Sure.
Because it's another great country.
Yes.
Yeah, yes. Oh, what a scintillating presentation. What one expects from Kishore every time. Having listened to you so many times in India and in Singapore. And once again, this book, I think, is going to create waves once again. A very short question. In these changing conditions, what would you, as an expert on India as well, ask India to do, and how should it relate to China in the present times?
Well, I think, I say in the book that India is actually entering a geopolitical sweet spot. India is now going to be courted assiduously by United States, and you've seen that already with President Bush, President Obama, and even President Trump. And India is going to be courted assiduously also by China. You see there's an amount of time that President Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Modi have spent with each other, talking with each other. And so, in a sense, to put it, and I hope my Russian friends don't mind this, just as the United States courted China to use as a counterbalance against the Soviet Union, in the same way, United States is trying to court India to use as a counterbalance against China. So the question is, what is the best position for India to be in? And the lesson of history, geopolitics is very clear. Once you're clearly aligned, you're taken for granted. Then we already got them on our side. We don't have to spend time with them. But if you can imagine a seesaw with United States on one side and China on the other side, the best place for India to stand is in the middle. So wherever India puts its foot, the seesaw goes in that direction. So then it makes sure that India will continue to be courted by United States and by China. Once you're taken by either side, then you're no longer, and India is big enough to be an independent player. And at the same time, one of the key points that many Indians are not aware of is that, frankly, there's another point that I've also written about, is that there's a vacuum of global leadership today, clearly, and partly because, Trump his only goal is to make America great again. He's not interested in the rest of the world. He's an honest man. China actually doesn't want to lead the world. China wants to just take care of China. And Europe today is drifting. I mean, Europe really is very sad. Europe has a leadership option, cannot provide it. Japan doesn't have to do it. So the one country that actually has the opportunity, if it wants to use it, to provide global leadership is India, because India's advantage is that it is a country that is trusted by a lot of countries. And of course, you're trusted by a lot of countries because you're not seen as a threat, right, by other countries. So that provides a magnificent geopolitical opportunity across two dimensions. One in the geopolitical balancing game, and the other is in the global leadership game. But unfortunately, as you know, there are not many voices in India speaking out about this opportunity that India has. And I hope that you will try to do so.
Thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you very much for your great talk. It was most interesting. We could have asked many more questions, but unfortunately we know that you have other engagements.
Thank
And I hope you can come to Moscow one day and we'll see you in person. 1974 was a long time ago, actually, when you first came, you said. We had some changes since that time.
I've been there more recently.
Yes.
Okay.
I hope to see you here in Moscow or in Singapore. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It was a great pleasure.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.